To destroy a dynasty, you do not need an army. You need only a single sheet of parchment, slipped quietly between the butcher's bill and the cost of winter coal. Eleanor Ashworth did not know she possessed a weapon. She thought she was merely holding her family together. For 4 years, she had been the invisible sister, the quiet woman in the corner who poured the tea, managed the shrinking funds, and knew exactly how many months remained until their absolute ruin. The number was 11. But the plain brown ledger she opened every night and closed every morning, the book she held against her chest in the dark while she calculated how much longer they could survive, held more than the mathematics of their despair. Between its columns, hidden in the narrow margin where October's losses met November's debts, lay a dead man's final secret. Her father had placed it there because he knew his daughter. He knew she was the only person in the world who would look between the numbers. He was right. She found it. And the moment she unfolded that single sheet of paper, every powerful man in London had a reason to find her. One of them was already sitting in her drawing room, pretending to court her sister. There is a moment just before a woman understands that her life has been rearranged without her permission, when the room she is standing in becomes very sharp. But this is not where the story begins. It begins with tea, and a woman who poured it for everyone except herself. If you have ever been the person who holds everything together while no one notices, this story will stay with you long after it ends. Subscribe, settle in, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. There is a moment just before a woman understands that her life has been rearranged without her permission, when the room she is standing in becomes very sharp. The edges of things clarify. The sound of a teaspoon against porcelain becomes distinct, singular, almost musical. The light from the window finds a particular slant, and the dust moving through it slows, and the woman standing in that light feels, for one disorienting second, that she has stepped outside of time and is looking back at herself from a great distance, watching the exact instant everything changed. Eleanor Ashworth did not recognize that moment when it arrived. She was too busy with the tea. The Ashworth family occupied a house on Bellam Square that was slightly too large for their current means, and significantly too large for their current happiness. It had been built by Eleanor's grandfather, a man of considerable fortune and even more considerable confidence, who had believed that a house with 14 rooms and a south-facing garden would ensure his descendants lived lives of comfort and social relevance for generations to come. He had been half right. The house remained. The fortune had not. What the Ashworths had instead of money was Rosalind. Rosalind Ashworth was 20 years old, golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, and in possession of a laugh that could make a crowded room go quiet, simply because everyone wanted to hear it again. She played the pianoforte with feeling. She danced with grace. She could discuss Wordsworth, but not so thoroughly as to intimidate. She was, by every measure that polite society used to weigh a young woman's worth, perfect. Their mother, Mrs. Caroline Ashworth, had understood this from the moment Rosalind turned 16, and a retired colonel at a dinner party had called her the most beautiful girl in the county, with the earnest conviction of a man stating a geographical fact. From that moment forward, Caroline had bent the full force of her considerable will toward one objective. Rosalind would marry brilliantly. Rosalind would marry in a manner that would restore the Ashworth name to the position her grandfather's house still stubbornly suggested it deserved. Eleanor, who was 24, was not part of this plan. She had never been part of any plan, and she had long since stopped expecting to be. She was not unattractive. That was usually the first thing people said about her, and the fact that it was phrased as a negative told you everything you needed to know about how the world had decided to see her. She was tall, where Rosalind was delicate, dark-haired, where Rosalind was fair, quiet, where Rosalind sparkled, and serious in a way that made people in drawing rooms slightly uncomfortable, as though her attention, when she turned it on someone, saw a little more than they had intended to show. She had her father's eyes. Everyone said so, usually with a small, sad pause, because her father, Thomas Ashworth, had died 4 years ago in a manner that the family described as sudden illness, and the doctor's private correspondence described more accurately as a heart that had simply exhausted itself trying to keep pace with his debts. He had been a gentleman, a distracted man, a man who read too much and managed too little. And Eleanor had loved him with the particular fierceness of a daughter who understood that love and competence were not the same thing. After his death, the house on Belem Square had become a kind of stage. Caroline directed, Rosalind performed, and Eleanor managed everything else. She managed the household accounts, which involved a monthly ritual of creative mathematics that would have impressed a seasoned banker. She managed the cook, Mrs. Briggs, who was loyal but increasingly resentful of the shrinking food budget, and who expressed this resentment through a series of ever more aggressive soups. She managed the 2 remaining servants, the correspondence, the invitations, the social calendar, and the delicate art of appearing prosperous while spending almost nothing. And she poured the tea. This was not a metaphor. It was a precise, literal function. When visitors came to Belem Square, Eleanor sat slightly apart from the main conversation, positioned near the tea service, and she poured. She offered sugar. She inquired about milk. She ensured that the small domestic machinery of a social visit operated without anyone having to think about how it operated. She was in the language of the household, the hostess. In practice, she was the person who made the room work so that Rosalind could shine in it. She did not resent this. She did not resent Rosalind, who was genuinely kind and had never once treated her sister as anything less than essential. She did not resent her mother, whose ambition came from a place of genuine terror about what would happen to all of them if Rosalind did not marry well. Eleanor understood the mathematics of their situation with a clarity that neither her mother nor her sister possessed. She knew exactly how many months of careful spending remained before the house itself would have to be sold. She knew the number because she had calculated it at the writing desk in her room at 3 a.m. by candlelight, with steady hands and a cold feeling in her stomach. And the number was 11. 11 months. After that, Belem Square would go. The 3 of them would move to a set of rented rooms, somewhere respectable but diminished, and the last physical evidence that the Ashworth family had once been something would disappear, and with it any reasonable chance of Rosalind attracting the kind of match that could save them. So Eleanor poured the tea, and she did it well. And if sometimes late at night she sat in her room and felt a loneliness so complete it seemed to have weight and temperature, she kept that to herself, because there was no one in the house whose burden was light enough to take on hers as well. She kept the loneliness in the same place she kept everything she could not afford, which was inside the household ledger, between the columns of figures that told the truth about their lives. The ledger was a plain brown book with a cracked spine and pages soft from handling, and she opened it every night and closed it every morning, and the ritual of it had become as necessary as breathing. The one place where she allowed herself to see their situation without the filter of hope or performance. The numbers did not lie. The numbers did not pretend. The numbers said 11 months, and Eleanor heard them and kept going. She was 24 years old, and she had not wanted anything for herself in 4 years. Not because wanting was impossible, but because she had decided, deliberately, that it was irresponsible. Her father had wanted things for himself, his books, his silence, his gentle life. And the wanting had blinded him to the debts and the danger and the slow collapse of everything he was supposed to protect. Eleanor had learned the lesson of his death thoroughly. Wanting was a luxury. Needing people was a risk. She folded both up and put them away and closed the ledger on them and went downstairs and boiled the kettle, and became the most reliable, invisible person in any room she entered. On the morning of the 14th of April, everything was different. Eleanor knew this because her mother had been awake since 5, which was unprecedented, and because the house smelled of beeswax polish and fresh flowers, which was expensive, and because Rosalind was wearing her newest dress, the pale blue one with the embroidered bodice that had cost more than Eleanor wanted to think about, and which her mother had justified as an investment. The Duke of Calder was coming to tea. His name was Alexander Vane, and he was, by the unanimous verdict of every drawing room and gossip column in England, the most eligible man of the season. He was 31, unmarried, and in possession of an estate in Northumberland, a house in London, and a fortune that made other fortunes feel inadequate. He was known to be intelligent, which some people found admirable and others found inconvenient. He was known to be private, which society interpreted as proud. He was known to be handsome, though descriptions varied depending on who was doing the describing and how recently they had been in his company. What was known with certainty was that he had, 3 weeks ago, been introduced to Rosalind Ashworth at a ball hosted by Lady Pemberton and had danced with her twice, which was the social equivalent of a cannon firing across the bow of every other eligible young woman in London. What followed was a letter to Mrs. Ashworth, requesting permission to call. The letter was brief, correct, and bore the ducal seal. Caroline had read it 4 times, wept twice, and immediately commissioned the flowers. Eleanor had read the letter once, and noted that its language, while perfectly proper, was unusually spare. 3 sentences. He wished to call. He proposed Tuesday at 3. He trusted the timing was convenient. It was the letter of a man who did not waste words. Eleanor found this interesting, then set the thought aside, because it was not her business to find the Duke of Calder interesting. That was not what she was for. At 2:30 she was in the drawing room, checking the arrangement of chairs, the positioning of the tea service, and the angle of the curtains which her mother had changed 3 times that morning. The room looked well. It always looked well when Eleanor prepared it, because she had a particular talent for making a space feel warm and considered, without appearing effortful. She knew where to place a chair so that afternoon light fell on the seated person's face without being harsh. She knew the exact distance between 2 seats that allowed conversation without crowding. She knew that flowers should be placed where they could be seen, but not smelled too strongly, because strong scent in a small room made people restless without knowing why. These were things she had learned from years of watching rooms and the people in them, from her position at the edge, the perpetual observer, the woman by the tea service who saw everything, because no one thought to guard themselves against someone they did not see. Rosalind came in wearing the blue dress and looking precisely as beautiful as the dress demanded. She was nervous, which she showed by touching the brooch at her collar, and then stopping herself, and then touching it again. "Do I look all right?" "You look perfect," Eleanor said, and meant it. Eleanor. Rosalind crossed the room and took her sister's hands. Her grip was tight. "I am glad you are here. I could not do this without you." "You could," Eleanor said gently, "but you do not have to." Their mother appeared in the doorway, wearing her best afternoon dress and an expression of controlled intensity. She looked at the room, at Rosalind, at the tea service, and finally at Eleanor with a gaze that moved quickly past her. Eleanor was not the element that needed attention. Eleanor was the element that could be relied upon. "Eleanor, you will manage the tea. Sit near the window. Be pleasant, but do not dominate the conversation." "Yes, Mother. And please do not discuss anything too serious. Men of his position do not want to hear about account books." "I was not planning to discuss account books." "Good." Caroline paused, and something moved behind her eyes, quick and complicated. A thought she considered and then dismissed. But she was Caroline Ashworth, and the situation was what it was. So she turned back to Rosalind and began adjusting the fall of her sleeve. Eleanor went to the window and sat down. She placed her hands in her lap and looked at the street below. A fine April day, bright and sharp. The trees along the square just beginning to green. A cat, orange and enormously fat, sat in a patch of sunlight on the front step of the house across the street, with the complete satisfaction of a creature that had no appointments and no anxieties, and intended to keep it that way. She watched the street, and waited, and felt what she always felt in these moments, a kind of careful quietness, as though she were drawing a curtain around herself, pulling the visible parts of her personality inward, so that what remained was only function, only usefulness, only the smooth and seamless operation of a woman who existed to make the room work. And then a carriage stopped at the gate. The Duke of Calder did not arrive the way Eleanor had expected. She had expected something imposing, a man who entered rooms and immediately rearranged them around himself. What she saw instead, when the drawing-room door opened and the footman announced him, was a man who entered quietly. He was tall, that much was accurate, dark-haired, with a face that was striking rather than conventionally handsome, strong-boned, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and eyes that suggested something else entirely. They were dark, those eyes, nearly black in the afternoon light, and they moved across the room with a quality of attention that Eleanor recognized instantly, because it was the same quality she saw in her own mirror every morning. He was reading the room, not scanning it, not glancing, reading it the way a person reads a page, taking in every detail, every relationship between objects and people, and filing it somewhere behind an expression that gave away nothing. He was dressed well, but without ostentation. Dark coat, clean lines, excellent tailoring that did not call attention to itself. He looked like a man who had long ago decided that his clothes should not be the most interesting thing about him. But it was his eyes that held her, the way they moved. They tracked across the room with a precision that was almost tactical, and when they reached the tea service, they stopped. Not on her, on the arrangement itself, on the careful geometry of cups and saucers, and the small vase of primroses she had placed at the corner of the tray, because primroses were cheerful without being aggressive, and suggested spring without demanding attention. Something shifted in his face, a fraction of a degree, a tightening around the eyes that might have been recognition, or might have been pain. It was there and gone so quickly that Eleanor was not certain she had seen it at all, except that she was Eleanor Ashworth, and she was always certain of what she saw. She simply did not always know what it meant. Caroline rose with a warmth that was only slightly too bright. "Your Grace, what an honor." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Ashworth." His voice was low and even. He spoke the pleasantry as though it were a fact rather than a formula, which gave it a quality of sincerity that surprised Eleanor. Most men of his standing delivered drawing-room courtesies like coins dropped into a collection plate, automatically and without inspection. He turned to Rosalind. He sat. He accepted the chair Caroline indicated. Eleanor rose and went to the tea service and began to pour. The ritual was so familiar that her hands moved without conscious direction, and this freed her attention to observe. Caroline opened the conversation with the skill of a woman who had rehearsed. The Duke listened. He responded appropriately. He was polite. He was correct. And Eleanor, watching from the tea service, noticed something that no one else in the room would have seen, because no one else was looking. He was not interested. Not bored. Not rude, not dismissive, simply not engaged in the way a man is engaged when he has come to a house with romantic intent. His responses to Rosalind were courteous but measured. His body carried none of the subtle inclination, the unconscious forward drift that Eleanor had observed in every other suitor who had sat in that chair. She brought his tea. She had poured it without asking his preference, because she had noticed him glance at the cup nearest the pot, the strongest. She set the cup on the table beside his chair. "Your tea, Your Grace." He looked up at her, and something happened that Eleanor did not expect and could not have prepared for. He looked at her, not past her, not briefly, not with the glazed courtesy of a man acknowledging a peripheral family member. He looked at her with the full focused attention he had been giving to the room when he first entered, and for one sharp, disorienting moment, Eleanor Ashworth felt herself become visible. It lasted 3 seconds. His eyes held hers, and they were not casual, and they were not polite. They were the eyes of a man who had been looking for something, and had just found it in a place he had not expected. And the finding of it had cost him something, because for that one unguarded moment, His face held an expression she recognized from the inside. The expression of a person who sees something they thought they had lost. "Thank you," he said. His voice had shifted by a degree so small that only someone listening very carefully would have caught it. She returned to her seat near the window. Her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with carrying a teacup across a room. The visit continued, and once more, unmistakably, Alexander Vane looked at Eleanor. It happened when Caroline asked about his estate in Northumberland. He spoke about the land with a directness that suggested genuine feeling, describing the moorland and the way the light changed across it in autumn. And as he spoke, his gaze drifted to Eleanor, as though checking whether his words had landed somewhere that understood them. She was looking at him when it happened, and this time neither of them looked away for a full 4 seconds, which, in a drawing room full of people, was an eternity. She felt the blood rise in her cheeks and dropped her gaze to her hands. But during those minutes, while her eyes were on her hands, something else happened. He was speaking to Caroline about the house, and in the middle of a sentence, his voice changed by the smallest degree, and he said, "This room is particularly well arranged. It has a quality I have not encountered often, a warmth that feels considered rather than accidental." Caroline brightened. "How kind of you to say." He nodded politely at Caroline, but his eyes moved briefly to Eleanor, and this time the look was not searching. It was knowing, as though he had already understood who had arranged the room and was acknowledging it in the only way the situation permitted. Then something else happened. His gaze continued past Eleanor to the bookshelf behind her chair, and stopped. A pause so brief it was almost invisible. Eleanor turned to see what he was looking at. It was her father's shelf. His books, his papers, a small brass compass he kept as a paperweight, and leaning against the side, a framed certificate. A certificate of professional membership in a legal clerks association, signed at the bottom in her father's careful hand, and beside his signature, the counter-signature of the association's presiding officer. The counter-signature read, in small but clear script, "The Marquis of Albourne," who had been, before his elevation, Charles Vane, Alexander's father. Eleanor had seen that document 1,000 times. She had never thought about the counter-signature, but Alexander Vane had looked at it, and something that had been warm in his expression was replaced by something she could not name. Not coldness. Something closer to the expression of a man who has just remembered why he came to a place, and finds the reason less comfortable than the distraction he found instead. The visit ended. He thanked Mrs. Ashworth. He told Rosalind it had been a pleasure. Then he turned to the tea table, where Eleanor was stacking cups, and said, "Miss Ashworth, I wonder if I might trouble you for one more cup before I go." The room paused. He crossed to the tea table, close to her, and she could see now the details that distance had softened. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a small scar across his knuckle, the way his dark hair fell slightly forward at the temple. He accepted the cup. He did not drink from it. He looked at her and said very quietly, so that only she could hear, "You arranged this room yourself." It was not a question. "Yes. How did you know?" "Because it is the only room I have been in this season that was arranged for comfort rather than impression." He held her gaze. "It reminded me of someone." She wanted to ask who. She said instead what was honest. "I wanted whoever sat in this room to feel welcome, rather than evaluated." Something moved across his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the place where a smile would be if he allowed it. "You succeeded," he said. Then he set the untouched tea on the table, inclined his head, and left. Eleanor stood at the tea table for a long time after the front door closed. She heard her mother's voice bright with analysis. She heard Rosalind's softer responses. She heard all of it from a great distance, because she was standing in the sharp, clear center of a moment she had not known was coming, and the room was very bright, and her hands resting on the table beside an untouched cup of tea were not steady anymore. She picked up the cup and carried it to the kitchen, and washed it herself, standing at the basin with her sleeves rolled up. It reminded me of someone who arranged rooms the way Eleanor arranged rooms. And more than that, the certificate on the shelf, her father's name beside his father's name, a connection she had not known existed. But Alexander had looked at it, and his face had changed, and something warm had been replaced by something harder. She went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk. She opened the household ledger and stared at the numbers. 11 months. The flowers for today's visit had cost more than a week of groceries. Every small expense was a stone removed from a wall that was already too thin. Eleanor closed the ledger and held two feelings side by side. The sharp, terrifying warmth of being seen, and the cold, precise instinct that told her this man had not come to Belem Square only for the reason he had stated. He came back. 3 days later, another letter, another request to call. Caroline was euphoric. Eleanor arranged the drawing room again, but this time she moved the framed certificate from the bookshelf to her room, face down on the desk. She wanted to see whether Alexander's gaze would go to the same place and find the absence. It did. 15 minutes into the visit, his eyes moved to the bookshelf, tracked along it, and stopped at the gap. His face changed by 1 degree. He looked back at the conversation. He did not look at Eleanor. But she had seen it, and now she was certain. He knew the certificate. He knew the connection between their families. He had been looking for it. The rest of the visit was correct, polite, calibrated. And then, Rosalind mentioned a novel she had been reading, and the Duke said, "Have you read Gaskell's North and South, Miss Rosalind?" "I have not. Is it very good?" "I think," he said, and then paused, his gaze moving to Eleanor. "I think it is a book about what happens when someone is seen clearly for the first time." Eleanor felt the words land like a stone in still water. She kept her eyes on her hands. Then she looked up because she could not help it, and he was watching her, and his expression was completely unguarded, and what she saw was recognition. The look of a person who has found something they were not sure existed. After the visit, Rosalind came to Eleanor's room. She sat on the bed and pulled her knees up. "He is strange," Rosalind said. "Strange how?" "He says all the right things. But Eleanor, I do not think he is listening to me. He responds correctly, but he is not present." She paused. "When he looks at me, I feel like he is looking for something that is not there. Something I do not have. And I think perhaps he knows that, too." Eleanor sat at her desk with the ledger open and her heart doing something painful in her chest. "Perhaps he is shy," she said carefully. Rosalind kissed her sister's cheek, said goodnight, and left. Eleanor sat until the candle burned low, and then she sat in the dark, and she did not think about Alexander Vane. She thought about her father, about the countersignature. Charles Vane had been the presiding officer of the Clerks Association, which meant he had known Thomas Ashworth professionally. But the certificate was from 12 years ago, a routine connection. There was no reason for it to matter now. Unless it was not the only connection. Eleanor lit a new candle. She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed, where she kept her father's personal papers. She had gone through them once, 4 years ago, looking for anything that might explain the debts, and had found nothing, except the evidence of a man who was better at reading contracts than at negotiating them. She went through them again with different eyes that were looking for a name. She found it at 1 in the morning. A letter in her father's handwriting, addressed but never sent, folded inside a notebook. The envelope read, "His Grace the Duke of Calder, Renfield House, Alderley Square, London." The previous Duke, Alexander's father. The letter was dated 8 months before Thomas Ashworth's death. Your Grace, I write regarding the Whitmore survey and title documents, which I was engaged to authenticate on behalf of your estate's solicitors in the matter of the Northumberland boundary settlement. I have completed my review. I must inform you that I cannot in good conscience provide the authentication as instructed. The survey, as presented, does not correspond to the original boundary markers established in the 1796 deed. The discrepancy is significant and involves approximately 400 acres of moorland currently designated as part of the Calder estate, but which, by the terms of the original deed, belongs to the Whitmore family trust. I am aware that this finding is unwelcome. I cannot, however, sign my name to a document I know to be inaccurate. I have retained a copy of the original 1796 deed and my notes regarding the discrepancy. I will hold these in confidence unless compelled by law or conscience to do otherwise. I remain your obedient servant, Theodore Corwin Ashworth. Eleanor read it 3 times. The candle flame moved in a draught. The letter said what it said and did not change. Her father had been hired by Alexander's father to authenticate land documents. Her father had discovered the documents were wrong. Her father had refused to sign. Her father had kept a copy of the original deed. Her father had died 8 months later. She set the letter down. She placed her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. Alexander Vane had come to this house, and his eyes had gone to her father's shelf. Alexander Vane had come back and found the certificate gone. Alexander Vane had not come to Belem Square to court Rosalind Ashworth. He had come to find out what Theodore Ashworth had left behind. The two feelings that had been pulling in opposite directions resolved into a single feeling that was neither warmth nor cold. It was the feeling of a woman who has been seen and is now wondering whether being seen was the point, or whether it was a means to something else entirely. She did not sleep. In the morning, she made a decision. She would not be in the room for the next visit, and she would find out on her own terms what her father had been involved in and what Alexander Vane had come looking for. She told her mother she had a headache. The third visit came 4 days later, and Eleanor was not there. She had gone to an address she found in her father's notebook, a solicitor named Alastair Foyle on Merton Street. Foyle was a small, precise man of about 65, with white side whiskers, and the cautious manner of someone who had spent decades knowing things he could not say. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been relief. "Miss Ashworth, I was not expecting you, though I confess I have been hoping someone from your family would come." She placed the unsent letter on his desk. She watched him read it. "Your father came to me 8 months before he died," Foyle said. He had been engaged by the Calder Estate's solicitors to authenticate a boundary survey. He discovered the survey was based on incorrect boundary markers. The original 1796 deed showed a different boundary. 400 acres of what the Calder estate claimed belonged to the Whitmore family trust, and he refused to authenticate. He refused. He was approached shortly afterward by a representative of the Calder solicitors, who made it clear the matter was not to be pursued. Foyle chose his words the way a man picks his way across ice. "Your father told me he received a visit. A man who told him his continued employment with the association depended on his discretion. Your father was frightened. Not for himself. For you and your mother and sister. His income depended on his professional standing. If the association withdrew his membership, he would lose his livelihood." "The counter-signature," Eleanor said. "Charles Vane was the presiding officer. Alexander's father held the power to destroy mine." Foyle's silence was confirmation. Eleanor sat very still. The architecture of her understanding rearranged itself. Her father had not simply died of a weak heart. He had died of 4 years of fear. The daily, grinding terror of knowing what he knew and being unable to act on it. His heart had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because it had been carrying too much for too long. The copy of the original deed, she said. My father said he kept one. He told me he had hidden it, Foyle said. He said only that it was in the place where his most careful work was kept. The place no one would think to look, because they would assume it was only numbers. Eleanor closed her eyes. The ledger. The household ledger. The book she opened every night and closed every morning. Of course. Because Thomas Ashworth had known his daughter. He had known that Eleanor was the one who would keep the ledger, who would hold it close, who would never let it go. He had hidden the document in the one place he was certain only she would ever look. She thanked Foyle. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. Miss Ashworth, be careful. If the original deed proves the settlement was fraudulent, the implications are not merely financial. They are criminal. The current Duke has a great deal to lose. She looked at the old man. She thought of her father sitting in this same office, frightened, carrying a weight he could not put down. My father was careful, she said. I intend to be careful too. But I also intend to find out the truth. She walked home through the April streets. She walked quickly. She needed the ledger. But as she turned onto Bellum Square, she slowed and stopped, because a thought arrived that was worse than anything Foyle had told her. Alexander had come to her house. He had looked at her father's shelf. He had looked at her, had seen her, had spoken to her in a voice that made her feel like the only person in the room. And his family had spent 5 years sitting on a fraudulent land claim that her father had died keeping secret. If Alexander knew about the Whitmore deed, if he had come to find it, then everything he had said to her, the room, the tea, the being seen, all of it was a strategy. A careful room-reading strategy, deployed by a man who was very good at noticing what people needed and giving it to them. She had needed to be noticed. And he had noticed her. And the question that stood now in Eleanor's chest like a blade was whether the noticing was real. She went to her room. She took the ledger from the desk and sat on the bed and began turning pages, not reading the numbers, but looking at the pages themselves. She found it between October and November, between the month her father had died and the month that followed. A single sheet of heavy paper, folded twice, slipped between the pages so precisely that it lay flat and invisible against the columns of figures. She had held this book 1,000 times. She had never felt the extra sheet, because her father had trimmed it to match the size exactly. She unfolded it. The 1796 Whitmore deed. Original survey boundaries. Clear, precise, undeniable. 400 acres of moorland that did not belong to the Calder estate, and never had. Eleanor held the document the way she held the ledger, with both hands, with the weight of its contents pressing against her fingers. Her father had put this here. In her book. In the book only she touched. He had known she would find it. Maybe not when, maybe not why, but he had trusted that the woman who kept the numbers would eventually look between them. She folded the deed. She placed it back in the ledger. She closed the book. She held it against her chest and felt the full, impossible weight of what her father had left her. Not money, not security. The truth. And the truth was heavy. And it was hers, and she was the only one who could decide what to do with it. Downstairs, she heard the front door open. The visit was over. She heard Caroline say his name. She heard the word wonderful. She heard the word promising. She held the ledger tighter. The next morning, Eleanor came downstairs to find her mother in the parlor with a glass of sherry before noon. He asked about you, Caroline said. The Duke. He arrived, sat with Rosalind, was polite, and then not 20 minutes in he asked where you were, by name. He asked whether you would be present at future visits. She studied Eleanor. Why is he asking after you? I do not know. He has also written a note. To you. Caroline produced a folded paper, sealed with plain wax, not the ducal crest. I have not opened it. But Eleanor, I need you to understand what is at stake. I understand. I have always understood. She took the note upstairs. His handwriting was clean and direct. Miss Ashworth, your absence today was noticed and felt. I owe you an honest explanation for my behavior, which I suspect you have already partly understood, because you are the most observant person I have encountered in a very long time. I would like to speak with you directly. If you are willing, I will be at the reading room of the British Museum tomorrow at 11. I will wait for 1 hour. If you do not come, I will understand. A. Vane. She read it 3 times. She placed it inside the ledger, beside the deed, between October and November, because that seemed like the right place for something impossible. At 10:30 the following morning, she put on her grey coat and her plainest hat. She put the ledger in her bag, not the deed, the whole ledger, because she was Eleanor Ashworth, and she did not go anywhere without the numbers. She walked to the British Museum quickly, not because she was eager, but because if she walked slowly, she would stop, and if she stopped, she would turn around, and some part of her, some stubborn, reckless, still-living part that she had spent years pressing flat and folding small, refused. The reading room was vast and domed and hushed. The light fell from above, soft and directionless, and the curved walls of books rose around her like the interior of something ancient and patient. He was at a table near the east wall. He was looking at the entrance. When he saw her, something moved across his face. Relief. Pure and uncontrolled, and gone almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced by the composed stillness she recognized as his defense. His version of the thing she did when she sat by windows and folded her hands and made herself small. He pulled out a chair. She sat. He sat across from her. Between them, the table and the weight of everything. "You came," he said. "I almost did not. Thank you." She placed her hands on the table, folded. She kept the ledger in her bag. "Alexander, you are courting my sister." "No, I am not." She gave him the silence, deliberately, as a space for truth to enter. "I was invited to tea with your family," he said. "I accepted because I was told your sister was remarkable." "She is. She deserves someone who values what she is. That person is not me." He paused. But that is not the whole truth. Something tightened in Eleanor's chest. "I came to your house because I knew your father's name. My father, before he died, told me a man named Ashworth had been engaged in an authentication matter for the estate. There had been a disagreement. After my father died, I found references in his solicitor's files to a boundary survey and a note that the authentication had not been completed. The authenticator had retained materials relevant to the estate's legal position." He looked at her directly. "I came to London to find those materials. I learned the authenticator was Thomas Ashworth. I learned he had died. I learned he had daughters, and that the younger one was of an age and beauty that would make an introduction plausible. I danced with your sister. I wrote to your mother. I came to tea." He stopped. "I came to your house to find a document. That is the truth. That is the part that will make you angry." He paused. "The next part is also the truth, and it is the part that complicates everything. I walked into your drawing room, and I was not prepared for what I found." His voice lost its even quality. "My mother was like you. She was the person who made the rooms work. She noticed the angle of a chair. She ran that house not as a performance, but as a practice, a daily practice of attention and care. And when she died, I was 19, and the house stopped feeling like a house and became a building. Just walls and furniture and rooms that no one arranged, because the person who understood how to arrange them was gone." He looked at Eleanor, and his eyes were not composed, and they were not careful. "I walked into your drawing room and I felt her. For the first time in 12 years, I walked into a room that felt the way her rooms felt. And I looked at you, and I saw the person who had made it feel that way. And I knew I was in trouble. Because I had come for the document, and I had found something I was not prepared for, and I did not know how to hold both things at once. Eleanor's hands were trembling. She pressed them harder together. "So you looked at me," she said, "and you saw your mother." "No," he said it quickly. "I looked at you and I recognized something. The quality of attention, the intelligence of care. But you are not my mother. You are yourself." What I felt was not memory. It was the shock of finding that a thing I thought was gone from the world still existed. In someone who did not know she was extraordinary, because no one had ever bothered to tell her. She could not breathe for a moment. The thing happening in her chest was too large for the space she had built for it. She had spent 4 years making herself small, and the sudden expansion of being described as someone who mattered was almost physically unbearable. "And the document," she said, forcing herself because she was Eleanor and she dealt with facts even when the feelings were enormous. "You still want it? I need to tell you what it means. The original boundary deed proves that 400 acres of the Calder estate were awarded fraudulently. If it surfaces, the settlement will be overturned. The land will revert to the Whitmore Trust. But more than financial loss, the fraud was perpetrated by my father's solicitors acting on my father's instructions. If the deed is made public, my father's name will be disgraced. Criminal charges could be brought posthumously. The reputation I've spent 5 years trying to maintain will be destroyed." He looked at her. "So yes, I came for the document. If I am being completely honest, I came to ensure it did not surface. I came to protect my family, the way you protect yours." The symmetry landed like a blow. 2 families, 2 legacies. His father who committed a fraud, her father who discovered it. Both dead, both leaving behind children still paying the cost. She understood him. That was the worst part. And now? Now I am sitting across from a woman who has the document, because I am quite certain you have found it by now. And I am telling you I will not take it from you. I will not trick you. I will not use what I feel for you to influence what you do with it. He leaned forward. What I feel for you is real. It was not planned. It was the most inconvenient, most completely ungovernable thing that has happened to me since my mother died. I have spent 3 weeks trying to reconcile the reason I came to your house with the reason I cannot leave it, and I have failed, because there is no reconciliation. Both things are true. I came for the document, and I came for you. And I do not know how to make those 2 things fit, except to tell you both and let you decide. The reading room was very quiet. A page turned somewhere. Eleanor looked at this man with the eyes she had spent her life training. She looked for the lie. She looked for the seam in the performance. She did not find it. And that was either because there was nothing to find, or because he was better at this than she was. And both possibilities were terrifying. "I need time," she said. He nodded. The acceptance of a man who had just handed someone a blade and a gift and could not control which one she chose to use. She stood. She picked up her bag. "The room," she said. "The drawing room at Belem Square. I did not arrange it for you. I arranged it before I knew you were coming. I arrange every room that way, because that is who I am. Not a strategy, not a performance." "I know," he said. "That is why it mattered." She left the museum and walked into the April morning. She did not go home. She turned into a tea shop on Callum Street, where the tables were private, and she sat and opened the ledger and thought. She thought for 2 hours. She ordered tea and did not drink it. She was calculating, not numbers, consequences. She could destroy the deed, protect Alexander's family, become complicit in the fraud that broke her father's heart. She could take it public, vindicate her father, destroy Alexander. She could give the deed to Alexander, trust him, hand her only power to the person with the most reason to make it disappear. Or she could do something else. Something that required not choosing between the people she cared about, but insisting, with the stubborn, practical intelligence that was her truest quality, that there was a path that did not require anyone to be sacrificed. She did not find that path in the tea shop, but she began to see its shape, the way she saw the shape of a room before she arranged it. She paid for the cold tea and left. When she reached Bellum Square, a visitor was waiting. Not Alexander. A woman sitting in the parlor with Caroline. She was perhaps 35, with sharp cheekbones and hair the color of autumn leaves pinned severely back, and eyes that read rooms the way Eleanor read them. She wore a dress the color of deep wine and sat with the posture of a woman who expected to be the most interesting person present, and was usually right. "This is Lady Margot Hale," Caroline said, the Duke of Calder's cousin. Margot turned those sharp eyes on Eleanor, and what happened in them was not what Eleanor expected. Not the cataloguing look of a society woman measuring threat. Recognition, followed by interest, followed by warmth that was either genuine or expertly performed. "Miss Ashworth, I have heard a great deal about you." "From whom?" "From Alexander. He mentions you more than he realizes, which I find fascinating, because my cousin is not a man who mentions people without meaning to." Eleanor sat. She watched Margot the way she watched everyone, with the quiet patience of a woman who knew that people revealed themselves most when they believed they were doing the observing. Margot was charming. She asked about the house, the garden, Eleanor's reading, with a quality of attention that felt dangerously like the attention Alexander had given her, as though Eleanor were someone worth focusing on. And then, while Caroline was out of the room, refreshing the tea, Margot said something that changed the temperature. She said it lightly, the way a person drops a heavy stone into water from a great height, so that the splash looks small. "Alexander has always been very methodical, very precise about what he pursues and how. It is one of his finest qualities." She looked at Eleanor with bright, warm, entirely unreadable eyes. "I sometimes wonder whether the people he turns that attention on understand how deliberate it is, how completely every move is considered." She took a bite of her biscuit. "But then, I suppose that is what makes it so effective." Eleanor held her teacup and felt the words land exactly where they were intended, in the place where doubt already lived. Margot left with promises to call again. Eleanor sat in the drawing room and thought about what had just happened with precise clarity. That woman had come to place a single seed of doubt. She had done it with the skill of someone who understood that doubt did not need to be large to be effective, that a single, well-placed question could do more damage than 100 accusations. Is Alexander's attention real, or is it the most calculated thing about him? It was the same question Eleanor had been asking herself, and that was what made Margot dangerous. Not that she lied, but that she aimed her truths with precision. Eleanor went to her room and thought, who else knows about this document? If Alexander came looking for it to protect his estate, who would come looking for it to attack his estate? A cousin. A cousin with sharp eyes and a reason to want the Calder fortune redistributed. Margot had not come to befriend her. Margot had come to find out what Eleanor knew, and to ensure that whatever Eleanor decided, it would not be done in alliance with Alexander. Over the next 2 weeks, Margot called 3 more times. Each visit was charming, warm, full of the particular attention Eleanor had been starved of her entire life. And each visit placed another careful stone of doubt about Alexander. Never overt, just details, observations, perfectly aimed questions. Has Alexander told you about the Whitmore matter? It was such a complicated business for the family. Meanwhile, Alexander wrote 2 letters, both brief, both careful. He did not press. He asked only how she was. The letters were honest in their restraint. The letters of a man holding himself at a distance he did not want to maintain, because the woman on the other side had asked him to. Eleanor did not answer them. She held them. She placed them in the ledger. And then something happened that broke the pattern. Eleanor was walking home from the market in late afternoon. She did not immediately notice the man behind her. Medium height, brown coat, walking at a pace that matched hers precisely. She noticed him at the corner of Briar Row because she turned left and he turned left, and she had walked this route for 4 years, and she knew who belonged on it. She did not panic. She crossed to the other side of the street. He crossed. She entered a milliner's shop and stood by the window watching the street. He stopped outside. He waited. She left through the back into the alley. She walked quickly through 2 streets she knew well, past a bakery, through a passage between buildings, and emerged onto Bellum Square from the opposite direction. But her hands were shaking when she reached the front door. Someone was watching her. Someone wanted what she had. The line between a social game and a dangerous one had just been crossed. That evening she sat in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. Tea she had made herself. The ledger open beside her. Mrs. Briggs's orange cat, Admiral, on the chair opposite, with the placid self-importance of a creature who believed all chairs existed for his personal use. The door opened. Rosalind, in her nightgown, hair loose, stood in the doorway. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the ledger. She looked at her sister's face. "Tell me," Rosalind said. She sat down next to Admiral, who accepted her presence with a regal nod. "Tell me what is happening. Do not say it is nothing, because I have watched you for 3 weeks, and you are not sleeping, and you are carrying something too heavy, and I am your sister, and you do not have to carry it alone." Eleanor looked at Rosalind across the kitchen table, the candle between them, Admiral purring, the house quiet. She told her everything. The letter, the deed, Alexander's confession, Margot's visits, the man following her, all of it. Rosalind listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Rosalind was quiet for a long time. Her face in the candlelight was serious and older than her 20 years. "The woman," she said. "Margot. I do not trust her. I have been watching her when she does not know I am watching. She looks at you the way a person looks at a locked door they are trying to find the key to. She is not interested in you. She is interested in what you have." Eleanor nodded. "And Alexander?" Rosalind was quiet for another moment. "He hurt you. He came under false pretenses, and that was wrong. But Eleanor, he told you. He sat across from you and told you the truth, all of it, the bad and the good. And he did not take the document, and he left the decision with you." She looked at her sister. "I have sat across from 6 suitors in this drawing room. Not one of them has ever given me that kind of honesty. Not one has ever trusted me enough to make me angry." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. Not the tight string of vigilance. Something beneath it. What do I do? It was the first time in 4 years she had asked anyone that question. Rosalind took her hands. "You do what you always do. You look at the room. You see what no one else sees, and you arrange things so that everyone in it feels safe." She paused. "But this time, Eleanor, you put yourself in the room too. Not by the window. In the center." She held Eleanor's hands, and then said something that was perhaps the bravest thing either of them had said in 4 years. "And, Eleanor, I do not want him. I never wanted him. Not because he is not good enough, but because he is not mine. I sat in that drawing room and performed for Mama, and I did what I was told because I thought it was the only way to save us. But it is not. I will not marry a man who loves my sister, and I will not pretend to be a prize that saves the family. I am more than that." She paused. "And so are you." Eleanor saw beneath the golden hair a woman who had just refused the role assigned to her since 16, who had looked at the architecture of expectation built around her and said, "Not this." Something cracked in Eleanor's chest. Not broke. Cracked. The way ice cracks in spring when the water underneath begins to move. They sat in the kitchen until the candle burned low. They did not solve anything. They simply sat together, holding hands across the table, and the holding was enough. In the morning, Eleanor wrote 2 letters. The first to Alexander. "I have the document. I need to see you. Come to Belem Square tomorrow evening at 8, kitchen door." The second to Foyle. "I have found the Whitmore deed. I need your advice. Please come tomorrow evening at 7:30. That afternoon, she told her mother. She sat Caroline down and told her everything. Caroline listened. Her face went through changes Eleanor tracked with care. Shock, understanding, fear. And then something unexpected. Caroline closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her mouth. And when she opened her eyes, they were bright with tears that were not the strategic crying she did about social prospects, but something quieter, older. "I knew," Caroline said. "I knew your father was involved in something. He told me so little, but I knew he was frightened. I knew it had something to do with the Calder family." She stopped. "The night he died, I found a letter on his desk. I did not read it. I was afraid of what it said. I burned it." Eleanor went very still. "I burned it, and I have lived with that for 4 years, not knowing what it said. I burned it because I was terrified, and because I thought if I made it disappear, the danger would disappear with it." She looked at Eleanor, and her face was stripped of every defense. "It was not the deed," Eleanor said gently. "The deed was in the ledger. Whatever you burned was something else." Caroline shook her head. "It does not matter. What matters is that I was a coward. I let fear make my decisions. I pushed Rosalind toward this match because I thought proximity to the Duke would protect us. I let you carry this family because I was too broken to carry it myself. And I told myself it was strategy when it was grief." She reached across and took Eleanor's hand. "I have not been fair to you. I have let you disappear into the work of this house because watching you was too painful. You are so like him. Your steadiness, your attention. You are the best of your father without his weakness, and I could not bear it. So I looked at Rosalind instead. Because looking at Rosalind did not remind me of what I had lost." The afternoon light fell through the curtains in pale strips. "I am sorry," Caroline said. "And whatever you decide to do with that deed, you do it as yourself, not as my daughter, not as the family's keeper, as Eleanor, and I will stand behind you." Eleanor held her mother's hand and felt the crack widen, and the water beneath the ice was warm, and it hurt, and it was the best kind of hurt. That evening, Foyle arrived at 7:30. Eleanor showed him the deed. He examined it. Authentic. Clear. This is enough to overturn the settlement and restore the Whitmore land. He looked up. It is also enough to destroy the Calder estate's reputation. And if it disappears, then a wrong remains unrighted. The Whitmore family remains dispossessed, and your father's honesty counts for nothing. "There is a third option," Eleanor said. Foyle raised his eyebrows. "The deed goes to the Lord Chancellor's office, not as an attack, as a correction. The Whitmore heirs are located and restored. The boundary is adjusted. The Duke cooperates willingly, publicly, which preserves his reputation, because voluntary correction is very different from forced exposure. The settlement is resolved in a way that costs something, because the wrong was real, but does not destroy anyone. That would require the Duke's cooperation. Yes. It would require him to voluntarily surrender land and admit his father's error. Yes. It would require a great deal of trust. Yes, Eleanor said. It would. At 8 o'clock, there was a knock at the kitchen door. Alexander stood in the passage. His face was pale. His eyes found hers immediately. She stepped back. He came in. He saw Foyle and stopped. "Mr. Foyle was my father's colleague," Eleanor said. "He knows the full history. I have asked him here because what I am about to propose requires a witness." Alexander looked at her, something raw and frightened in his face, the face of a man who had walked into a room knowing he might lose everything, and had come anyway. Eleanor took the deed from the table. She held it in both hands. "This belongs to me. My father left it to me. He hid it in the only place he knew I would look. I've spent 3 weeks deciding what to do with it. I've considered every option and calculated every outcome, and I have arrived at this." She placed the deed on the table between them. "I will not destroy it. That would betray my father, who died for his refusal to participate in a lie. I will not give it to your cousin, who wants to use it as a weapon for her own claim. And I will not give it to you, because I need to know that what happens next is not about trust being given, but about trust being earned." She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet. Admiral slept on the chair by the stove, undisturbed by the small matter of a land fraud taking place in his kitchen. "I'm going to take this to the Lord Chancellor's office, myself, tomorrow morning. I'm going to file it as a legal correction, not a criminal complaint. The Whitmore heirs will be located, and you will cooperate. Publicly, willingly. You will acknowledge your father's error, and you will correct it, not because I am forcing you, but because it is right, and because the man I sat across from in the British Museum told me he wanted to be honest. And this is what honesty costs." Alexander looked at the deed. He looked at Foyle. He looked at Eleanor. And she watched his face with the attention that was her gift and her curse. What she saw was not calculation, not resistance. She saw relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he inherited and did not choose, who has known it was wrong and has not known how to make it right without destroying himself, and who has just been shown a way. He placed his hand flat on the table beside the deed, the way Eleanor placed her hand flat on the ledger. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough. "Tomorrow morning." Eleanor nodded. "I have one more condition." He looked at her. "When this is done, when the deed is filed and the correction is made and the cost is paid, I want you to come back to this kitchen and sit in that chair and drink the tea I pour for you. Not as a duke, not as a man with a strategy, as yourself." Something broke across his face, the last wall. What came through was not charm or persuasion, but something rawer and older, and more frightened than anything she had seen in him before. Eleanor. Her name in his mouth sounded like a door opening. Except now the door was wider, and neither of them was pretending not to see what was on the other side. "I will come back to this kitchen every day for the rest of my life if you will let me." She held his gaze. She was not ready to smile. There was too much still to do. "Start with tomorrow," she said. Foyle cleared his throat. He placed the deed in his leather case. "I will prepare the filing." He looked between them. "Your father would be proud," he said to Eleanor, and then to Alexander, "and I believe your mother would be too." He left. The night air came in briefly through the kitchen door, cold and sharp, and then it closed, and they were alone with the candle and the sleeping cat, and the space between them that was no longer a distance, but a threshold. Neither of them crossed it. Not yet. The threshold would wait. It had been waiting a long time. Alexander left through the same door. He stopped in the passage and turned. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow." She watched him go and held the doorframe with one hand, and felt the absence of the ledger's weight against her chest, and something else in its place, something carried differently, not as a burden, but as a choice. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She made herself tea and sat at the table and drank it slowly, while Admiral woke and looked at her and went back to sleep. And she thought about her father, hiding a deed between columns of numbers because he knew his daughter was the only person in the world who would look there. And she thought that the most careful man she had ever known had trusted the most careful woman he had ever made. And the trust had held. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She placed it on the shelf. She went upstairs and opened the ledger, which was lighter now by one document. 10 months. The number had not changed. The margin had not widened. Nothing about the deed or Alexander changed the arithmetic. But Eleanor looked at the numbers, and for the first time in 4 years, she did not feel the cold feeling in her stomach. She felt something more practical than hope. The feeling of a woman who has found the angle that works. Not because it is easy, but because it is honest. And honest solutions, like honest rooms, have a way of making everything around them work better. The Lord Chancellor's office occupied a building of significant weight on Lincoln's Inn Fields. Eleanor arrived at 9 in her grey coat and her plainest hat, carrying the deed in a leather folder. She had not dressed for impression. She had dressed for what she was. Foyle was waiting on the steps. Beside him, Alexander, simply dressed, no ducal regalia. He looked tired, and he looked like a man who had decided to show up as himself and let the consequences be what they were. He looked at her when she approached. No composed distance, just presence. She nodded. He nodded back. They went inside. The senior officer, Commissioner Halford, examined the deed. Eleanor spoke for 12 minutes, clear and precise, beginning with her father's engagement and ending with her decision to file the correction voluntarily with the Duke's cooperation. She did not embellish. She presented the facts the way she presented accounts, with accuracy and without sentiment. Alexander spoke next. He confirmed the history. He acknowledged his father's error. He authorized the correction. He did it in a low, even voice that carried cost. She could hear it in the way certain words landed. Father, error, authorize. Each one a small surrender, made with steady, deliberate courage. Halford listened. He examined the deed a second time. Miss Ashworth. The care with which this document was preserved and the manner in which it has been presented reflect well on your father's integrity and on your own. He paused. The work your father did, the authentication he refused to falsify, the record he kept at such personal cost, that is the work this office exists to honor. I want you to understand that what is in this folder is not merely evidence. It is the act of a man who chose his conscience over his safety, and a daughter who chose to finish what he started. Eleanor's throat tightened. She nodded. The correction will proceed. The Whitmore heirs will be located. The boundary will be adjusted. He looked at Alexander. Your Grace, your voluntary cooperation will be noted. You have made a wise choice. They left together, down the broad steps into the cold, bright morning. Foyle shook their hands. He looked at Eleanor. Your father trusted you with the truth. You have done it justice. He walked away. Eleanor and Alexander stood alone on the steps. Below them, London moved. Cabs and carts, people with their own lives. It is done, Eleanor said. Yes. The wind moved along the street. That afternoon, Margot came to Bellam Square unannounced. Eleanor met her in the drawing room. She did not offer tea. Margot noticed. I hear you visited the Lord Chancellor's office this morning. News travels. It does. Alexander cooperated. That surprises me. It should not. He is an honest man. Margot looked at her. The warmth she had been wearing for weeks shifted. What was beneath it was not cruelty, but something older and sadder. A tiredness that had been there all along beneath the sharp cheekbones and the clever eyes. "You know why I came to this house," Margot said. "Yes." "And you chose him anyway. The document was never a weapon. It was a correction." Margot's face collapsed quietly, the way a wall collapses when the last supporting stone is removed. "I wanted the Calder fortune redistributed," she said without pretense. "My claim through the maternal line is real, but not strong enough without leverage. Your father's deed would have given me that leverage. I came to use you." "I know," Eleanor said. "And you are not angry. I understand desperation. I calculate the months until we lose this house every night by candlelight. I understand what it makes a person willing to do." Margot stared at her. Something changed in her sharp, assessing eyes. From strategy to recognition. "You found someone who sees you," Margot said. She stood. She straightened her coat. Her face was composed again, but differently. Arranged not for attack, but for retreat. For the long walk back to a life where she had not found what Eleanor had found. She looked at Eleanor from the doorway. "I am still looking," she said. Then she left. Eleanor stood in the drawing room and felt, unexpected and fierce, a sympathy so strong it ached. Because Margot was what Eleanor might have been. A woman alone, overlooked, using every tool available to force the world to acknowledge her. The only difference was that Eleanor had been found, and Margot had not. And the difference was not merit. It was a man who walked into a room and saw a chair at the right angle and remembered his mother. At 8 o'clock, she was in the kitchen. She had lit the fire. She had set the table with 2 cups, the good ones, with the thin gold rim that had been her grandmother's. She had boiled the kettle. She had arranged the room, not for someone else's comfort this time, for theirs. The knock came. She opened the door. Alexander stood in the passage. He looked past her at the kitchen, the fire, the 2 cups, the table arranged with care. And his face did the thing she had seen on the first day, the tightening that was recognition. But now she knew what it meant. Not just memory. Her. The person who made rooms feel like someone was paying attention. "Come in," she said. He came in. She poured. Strong, no sugar. She set the cup before him. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. His eyes were simply present, open. He picked up the cup. He drank. It was the first time he had drunk the tea she poured for him. On the first visit, the cup had sat untouched, a prop, a pretext. Now it was a cup of tea made by a woman for a man in a kitchen on an April evening. He set the cup down. "This is the best tea I have ever had." She almost smiled. "It is the same tea I always make." "I know. That is why." They sat in the kitchen and talked. Not about the deed or the 400 acres. About the house, the stove that needed a new burner plate, the garden untended for years. Admiral, who appeared from under the stove and installed himself on the chair between them. They talked about his estate, the moorland, the kitchen there that was enormous and stone-floored, and had not been properly managed since his mother died. They talked about rooms and what made them work, and it was a conversation about furniture and domestic arrangement, and it was the most intimate conversation Eleanor had ever had, because it was about the thing that lived at the center of who she was, the thing she had done silently for years, and he understood it the way she understood it, not as a duty, as a love. His hand moved across the table and covered hers, simply, quietly. His fingers closed around hers, and his palm was warm, and it felt the way a good room felt. Considered. Right. She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you first saw me, I thought it was the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to me. And then, when I found out why you came, I thought it was the cruelest. And then, when you told the truth, I could not separate the gift from the blade." She held his gaze. "But I can now. Because the gift was real. You saw me not because it served your purpose, but despite the fact that it complicated it. And the blade was also real. Both things are true, and I have decided to hold both because that is what I do. I hold things. I keep the accounts, and I carry what is given to me, and I do not let go." She turned her hand over in his. She laced her fingers through his. "So I am holding this, both of it, the whole thing, and I am not letting go." His face gave way entirely. A complete, willing surrender of every wall he had built since his mother died, and the world taught him that showing what you felt was an invitation to be used. He lifted her hand and pressed it against his mouth. Not a kiss, something more private. The press of his lips against her knuckles was the gesture of a man holding something sacred. "Eleanor, I will spend whatever time you give me earning this." She felt the warmth of his mouth against her hand. She felt the kitchen around her, the fire, the bread smell from the stove, Admiral purring on his chair. "Start with the morning," she said. "Come back in the morning." He came back in the morning, and the morning after that. 3 months later, Eleanor Ashworth married Alexander Vane in a ceremony at St. George's that was smaller than society expected and warmer than society thought possible. She wore deep green, the color of the dress she had been wearing in the kitchen the night she told a duke she was holding both the gift and the blade. Rosalind stood beside her and wept with a happiness so genuine that 3 hardened society matrons found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs. She had met by then a man named James Holt, a barrister's son, who argued with her about land reform and looked at her afterward as though she had rearranged his understanding of the world. But that is Rosalind's story. Caroline sat in the front row with the face of a woman who had finally allowed herself to see what was in front of her. After the ceremony, she took Eleanor's hands and said only, "Your father would have been proud." The Whitmore correction took 11 months, the same number as the margin Eleanor had once calculated for her family's survival. The heirs were found in Lincolnshire. The boundary was adjusted. Alexander signed the documents himself. The cost was real, and he bore it. "The estate is smaller now," he said. "The estate is honest now," she said. Belem Square was saved through the restructuring of debts that Eleanor managed during the proceedings. Thomas Ashworth's professional reputation, restored by the public acknowledgement of his integrity, retroactively strengthened the family's legal position. It was not a rescue. It was competence, applied at a level that finally matched its capacity. Eleanor moved to Northumberland. She moved into a house that was enormous and ancient and draughty, and in need of exactly the kind of attention she was built to give. She reorganized the kitchens. She reviewed the accounts. She walked the moorland in the mornings, and the light moved across it in ways she had never seen in London. Great, sweeping changes of color and shadow that made the land feel alive. She set up a study in the east wing with good light and a strong desk and a chair by the window so she could see the moor while she worked. She opened a new household ledger on the first morning, a clean book with a strong spine, and wrote the first numbers in her father's careful hand. They were not the numbers of survival. They were the numbers of a life. On an evening in September, Alexander found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour on her wrist, checking the stove. He stood in the doorway, watching her with the expression she knew now as well as the accounts. The expression that meant the place he was in was less without her. She looked up. "Tea," she said. He crossed the kitchen. He put his hand on her waist and his mouth against her temple, and stood there, holding her, with flour on her wrist and the moor outside turning purple in the evening light. "Yes." Always. She poured. Strong, no sugar. She set the cup on the table. He sat. He drank. She sat across from him and held her own cup, and the kitchen was quiet, and the fire moved. "The east wing roof needs repair before winter," she said. He looked at her. He looked at this woman with flour on her wrist, and a new ledger upstairs, and a father's honesty in her bones, and the quality of attention that made every room she entered feel like it was being cared for by someone who understood that care was the thing that held everything together. He did not smile because he did not need to. His face simply held what it held, completely, without defense, the way a room holds warmth when it has been properly arranged by someone who understands that the purpose of a room is not to impress the people in it, but to make them feel that they are home. "I know," he said. "I will arrange it tomorrow."